Right, I'm going to give you a very short overview of a week that ended up being pretty busy ultimately. A week in Washington wasn't there to understand the total dislike and unhappiness with their new leader, but it was more around trying to get to the bottom of actually understanding how they operate and what was coming out. So the timing, I was across there in May. Their budget setting time is July, so they were building up for budget, so I wanted to try and understand where that was going to go. But I think importantly enough, World Bank, and we'll see it on a few slides later on, is, underdeveloped and fragile states is where their big focus is. So certainly Africa gets a lot of play, Latin America, parts of Asia, but Western Europe and North America, Australia don't feature in the equation at all. So when you start talking about some of the quantums, you'll get some ideas just now. So what I did do is, the World Bank was one part. I mean, World Bank itself occupies about 20,000 square meters of office space in Washington. It's a big outfit. Millennium Challenge Corporation, which equally gets involved in a lot of projects, IFC, and then MEGA to a lesser degree, and then right at the bottom, Power Africa, which is a subsidiary of USAID, but does have a particular angle on the African continent. So why did we go? Well, we've been singularly unsuccessful in getting anything over the line with the World Bank. And from our business point of view, we work in big project delivery space, and we had tried to get we had responded to a number of bids. They're quite onerous bids, and we had got nowhere. So we decided we had to try and understand it better. They also had a very confused procurement process. There were different vendor registrations. There were different areas you had to be involved in, whether you spoke to a task team leader, whether you spoke to a regional head, or whether you spoke to somebody in country versus Washington. It was quite challenging to try and understand how this all tied together. So we went to go and have a look and see how we could actually get to the bottom of it. Well, who helped us? Well, Africa House certainly did. They gave us some good introductions, and one of them was Bongi Kuneni, who is the South African representative. She actually just hosted a seminar here quite recently in Sandton about a month ago. And there's the Africa Council, but the US Africa Chamber. What is important and was very helpful from Roloff and his team was, once to try and get an appointment with somebody in the World Bank is quite difficult, but once you're in the building, everybody's very happy to see you and talk to you. So no one's prepared to come and fetch you at reception and sign you in, but once you're in the building, so you get in for a day, and you can actually spend your whole day in the building, and you'll be very busy talking to various people that didn't have appointments with you, but that seems to be how it works. I don't know if they're all bored inside the building and they've got nothing else to do, but it was just quite weird going from a fairly light schedule to a very busy schedule in the case of a couple of hours. I mentioned earlier who did we see? Well, we saw the World Bank primarily, IFC. It's all in the same precinct pretty much within Washington, D.C. itself. What was quite interesting is Power Africa, they do have consulting service providers that are on framework agreements with them, and they actually have quite a lot that they can dish out as well. So the likes of Nexent and Tetra Tech, who we spoke to. And interestingly enough, they don't really have a presence in Africa. They operate from America into Africa. So if you've got something in Africa to offer them, they're pretty receptive to it. And then the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So I suppose to try and understand it is, from a World Bank perspective, the World Bank spends between $15 and $20 billion a year in terms of the projects. So if you take that many of these projects run over multiple years, at any point in time, the World Bank's probably got in the vicinity of $70 to $80 billion of procured projects on the go. So it's a substantial capex to try access. What you can see is in 17, transportation energy takes a big part of that. They are moving more back to extractives. Obviously, there's now the commodity markets are picking back up. So if you look in the 18 market, they're starting to push more in the extractive market. But certainly, that is where it sat in the 17-year, more or less. As I mentioned earlier, this is an extract from Millennium Challenge Corporation. South Africa, from a World Bank point of view, doesn't really hit the mark. We're not an underdeveloped nation by their definition, so we do get some funding, pretty limited. So all the opportunity from World Bank and Millennium Challenge Corporation really falls outside of South Africa. It falls into a lot of East and West Africa, and you can see there's quite a big predominance there. A little bit the likes of Lesotho. MCC's been pretty busy there in the last little while. But certainly West and East Africa seem to get a lot more play than South Africa or certainly Southern Africa. Just giving a bit of a breakdown. So for the 18 years, so in other words, we are in the 18 financial year now for them. It started in July, as I mentioned. So the allocation for IDAs in Sub-Saharan Africa is $45 billion. I mean, it is a significant chunk of change, and there are a number of ways that actually rolls out. But just to give you a good idea, as I mentioned, you won't see South Africa feature here at all. So Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya, and we can break it down, going all the way down Zimbabwe on the right-hand side. But it just shows you the Ethiopia getting $4.5 billion worth of activity, whereas that's more than the bottom half of the entire table. So countries do seem to be in favor at different times for different reasons. Ethiopia is obviously putting a huge amount of infrastructure in. A lot of their projects meet the requirements that are talking to what the World Bank's intentions are. So they are getting a lot of the limelight at the moment. Just going back to for 18, so as I said, 17 transport and water and infrastructure was good. Energy and extractives are the big one coming up in 18 years. So $5 billion been allocated in that there. Agriculture still seeing quite a lot. Transport and ICT in itself is getting quite a lot of airplay at the moment. So what did we learn? So after 5 days of going around and seeing lots of people, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So in late 2016, led by a guy called Enzo, I'm trying to think, he's De Laurentiis. Enzo De Laurentiis is head of procurement at World Bank, and he has now got a framework agreed. It's a much more transparent framework. It is very engaging, and if you go onto that website there and you get into it, they can give you, they tell you what's coming up, what's going to be awarded, what has been awarded, who it was awarded to. So it is a much more transparent process than it ever was. It's the first revamp of the World Bank in probably 20 years from a procurement point of view. So that's a big step forward. Vendor registrations and all that nonsense is no longer a barrier. If you respond to a tender and you are the right guy for the job, they will actually help you through the vendor registration process, as opposed to the other way around. You couldn't tender before you're on the vendor list, and you couldn't get on the vendor list unless you're a tenderer. So it used to be quite challenging. They're also looking at global and regional allocations. So most of these tenders will be governed by the country that you're responding to. So World Bank will give them guidelines, but if you're doing something in Kenya, it'll come out of Nairobi. If you're doing something in SADC region, it'll probably come out of Pretoria. But it is certainly a lot clearer as to what they're doing and how they're allocating those regional portions. What became evident for us is language skills is important. So they do expect, if you're going to try and bid for something in Francophone Africa and you have no French-speaking capability in your bid, you're not going to get anywhere. So language skills is a big thing, and Francophone Africa is getting a lot of activity at the moment. They're probably getting a bigger share of the equation going forward. They're certainly seeing a lot more motivations for Francophone Africa projects at the moment. And that might be because they've been less exploited previously, or they've got more to add from a basic infrastructure point of view. Local knowledge is key. and that should help all of us. So they now are putting a big focus on local knowledge. So if you are local to the region, local to the country, local to the sectors that you're operating in, that will give you a distinct advantage over the guys who are competing from overseas. They've got pretty high technical thresholds, so don't think it's easy. I mean, they have simplified the procurement process, but they've got very particular technical thresholds that if you don't go past, even if you're the cheapest by a country mile, you won't be considered. So they're not going for cheapest price. They are holding quite a high level of technical due diligence to the process. And despite all the changes, so there was a big concern that with the Trump government, not to say the World Bank's depend on the Trump government, but they are a big contributor to it, that would scale off totally, and that's proven not to be the case. So certainly there's as much funding, if not more, going into the World Bank. So there's lots to go at. From an Africa perspective, the three main hubs, South Africa, Kenya and Senegal, and even though there are smaller hubs in other countries, those are the ones where your big decision makers sit, your big task team leaders in terms of the regional opportunities. What is most important, though, just in closing off, is the response recipe. They've now loaded some tips as to what makes a successful bid. They've actually loaded a whole aspect around adjudication criteria, which never used to exist before. And there is a recipe. If you can get the recipe right, you'll see when you go in there, same guys seem to get a lot of wins. It's just because they got the recipe right. So if you go in there and you follow it quite carefully, they will actually even help you in terms of you can ask questions. They'll come back to you. But how you write CVs, how you put stuff forward, there is a hell of a lot of documentation that you often have to attach to various bids and that. But if the size of the prize is big enough, it's certainly worthwhile. Right? Thanks.